Given that one catastrophic failure, is radically intolerable, we need to have accurate knowledge and not misattribute this absence of unwanted nuclear explosions to control.
That's the voice of Dr. Benoit Pelopidas. He's the founding director of the Nuclear Knowledges Program at Sciences Po in Paris. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Alex Hall.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Well, it was sad to say goodbye last week to my co-host, Michelle, and we wish her all the best at the State Department. And now I get to welcome Lauren to the intro. Thank you for stepping in, Lauren. How was your weekend?
Thanks, Tom. I'm so happy to be here. My weekend was great. My mom flew in, so I just picked her up from the airport and we hung out a bit. But how was your weekend?
Thanks. My weekend was very nice and quiet. Spring is coming, which is my favorite time of year. So I'm working on my backyard. We like to play badminton in the backyard. And the grass took a beating last fall. So I have to revive the grass, and hopefully it'll come back. But so far, all I'm doing is feeding the birds bird seed or grass seed, as the case may be. In the nuclear news, war in Ukraine. There's actually some good news coming from Ukraine. Russia is withdrawing troops from the region around Kyiv and shifting its forces to the east. So that's good as far as it goes. But of course, the attacks on Ukrainian civilians and soldiers continue, and very tragically so. And this war, even though Russia is moving its forces to the east, this war could go on for some time. And President Zelensky is asking for more weapons as a reflection of his assessment that the end is not in sight. In terms of the bizarro news, Russian soldiers took highly radioactive souvenirs from the Chernobyl nuclear site and dug trenches in the radioactive dirt around the site, according to the Ukrainian government. This is just crazy, and to me just shows how badly the Russians prepared for this attack. I mean, we've heard how badly they prepared for the invasion of Kyiv and how bad their planning was. But, this is just an example of that. Could they really have not told their troops about the radiation danger around Chernobyl? It's just kind of mind-boggling. It's almost as bad as the shelling of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. And all just goes to show how badly they prepared for this invasion. And I guess in some ways, it's good news that they didn't prepare for it, because their lack of preparation is showing. Lastly, on Ukraine, President Putin showed up at a funeral with his nuclear briefcase. Some news sources said this was a sign of increased readiness for nuclear war. That is actually not the case. This is business as usual. The Russian president travels pretty much everywhere he goes with his nuclear briefcase, just as the U.S. president, in this case now President Biden, travels everywhere he goes with his nuclear briefcase. So this is business as usual, not a sign of preparation for a nuclear attack. So just FYI. The Iran nuclear negotiations are still stalled. There was a report from Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, who wrote on Friday that the Biden administration had rejected Iran's demand to lift some sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which, if true, would be a devastating setback for the talks. We have not seen this confirmed by any official sources, so we're still tracking it, and so stay tuned for some definitive account on that. And then Tehran and Washington continue to blame each other for failing to take the necessary political decisions that need to be made to settle the remaining issues. So we stay stuck. And Lauren, turning to you, what do we have on early warning this week?
Early warning this week, Alex Hall is joined by Dr. Bridget Conley of the World Peace Foundation to discuss the protection of civilians in Ukraine and prospects for holding Russian perpetrators accountable.
And then Plowshares Fund President Emma Belcher interviews Dr. Benoit Pelopidas on his new book, Rethinking Nuclear Choices. They discuss how the debate around nuclear weapons has been intentionally left out of the public discourse in France and the United Kingdom, and how this affects national decisions about nuclear weapons policy. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation and Associate Research Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Her work focuses on the prevention of civilians and the study of mass atrocities. Bridget, thank you for joining.
Hi, thank you. It's so nice to be here.
The U.S., among others, are currently investigating Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Recent reports from Human Rights Watch document evidence of execution-style killings, including of over 300 civilians in Bucha. Can you outline for us the crimes this amounts to and how civilians are protected under the laws of war?
Yeah, so the evidence is still pouring in about atrocities in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine. So right now, analysis is a little bit of a moving target because key factors like context, patterns of violence and abuses, command permissiveness, or even ordering would all factor into how we'd understand which legal framework might apply. Nonetheless, intentional targeting of civilians is unquestionably prohibited under the laws of war, which addresses crimes like direct violence against people, murder, torture, rape, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure. So this could include pillaging, looting, targeting hospitals, or destroying objects that are indispensable to survival. So that would include food supplies, water, shelter, fuel, especially if and when people are barred from fleeing on the one side, or humanitarian aid is blocked from getting to those people. And the siege of Mariupol particularly raises this question. International humanitarian law offers another body of law that may be relevant, particularly the category of crimes against humanity. For acts of violence to be considered crimes against humanity, it would have to be proven that killings occurred as part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilians. As you and I think many of your listeners know, the charges of genocide had been also put a role in this conflict. That requires a higher burden of proof than either war crimes or crimes against humanity, because perpetrators must not only have committed certain acts, right, factually, but they also have to prove that they did those acts with the intent to destroy the targeted group as such. Right? So not only that they were intentionally, that is done with purpose, but also done with the purpose of destroying the group. The group also has to constitute a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and I think that question is pretty clear in the context of Ukraine. But whether or not they're being targeted with the intent to destroy the entire group of Ukrainians, that I think is less clear. Russian claims of genocide at the outset of the conflict, as far as I know, as far as I have seen, have absolutely no basis in fact.
So history, unfortunately, points to few cases where perpetrators have been accountable for such crimes, whether that's crimes against humanity or genocide. Do you think that this time can be any different?
There are possibilities, but there are some rather big hurdles. The chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has already stated that he's opened an investigation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, although neither Russia nor Ukraine, or the US for that matter, are members of the International Criminal Court. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, I think is going to be hearing a case between countries, right, between Ukraine and Russia, but that doesn't account for individual criminal responsibility. And so from history, we have a couple examples of leaders of a state who have been brought to justice, but very few where there was from a state like Russia, right, which possesses a significant degree of global power and influence and a veto if they would choose to use it in the UN Security Council. That adds a couple more issues. So one is political clout, right? Can Russia leverage its international political clout in order to block investigations or block prosecution, should that be in the offing? There's a second issue around whether or not someone who's indicted, who's a head of state or even former head of state, of getting them transferred to the relevant court. But there are a couple examples that might help us consider whether Russian leaders could be brought to justice. You know, one parallel is, of course, Nazi Germany, right? Very powerful state. They were only brought to justice, though, when there was a complete and definitive military defeat of the entire country. I think that is exceptionally unlikely in this context. I have not heard anyone argue that Ukraine or anyone else should try to push into Russian borders. But there are also cases of people who've been indicted for crimes and then are arrested when they travel abroad. On the other side, there were examples of Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir traveling within Africa even after he was indicted by the ICC. So another scenario, let's say there's a change eventually in the government inside Russia, such that the leaders who are charged with perpetrating crimes today would no longer be protected by the state. So we can think of Serbia and Sudan as examples, right, where Slobodan Milosevic and Omar al-Bashir, respectively, were ousted by popular uprisings. Milosevic was eventually handed over to the ICTY, but Sudan has opted to create a special tribunal within its domestic jurisdiction. In both of those cases, though, I think it's really interesting that the overthrow of these leaders was largely based on domestic concerns, not so much the indictments per se. So there are things we can do, though, to make it more likely that someone within the Russian military or political hierarchy might one day be prosecuted. Investigations by official and trusted sort of independent sources, evidence collection, all of which is ongoing right now. Maintaining international consensus as strong as possible that prosecutions and travel bans, for instance, would be honored. But there's also a point about the clarity of the hierarchies of concern. Ending the war and the atrocities at this point is more urgent. And there may be a narrow path to walk, between collecting evidence, investigations, and potential prosecution, and the work of mediating a settlement to the current conflict.
Putin has also made veiled threats of a nuclear attack, threatening consequences you have never seen in your history for anyone who tries to interfere. You have written on the question, do nuclear threats constitute incitement to genocide? Does it, and how would this be assessed?
Yeah, so this was an issue that genocide scholars worked on in the early days, sort of in the 1980s, 1990s. And I think it includes two questions, right? So one is, are there any clear connections between use of nuclear weapons and genocide? And two scholars who worked on this issue in the 1990s wrote something that I think still holds true, that between the two, right, a genocidal logic and a nuclear logic, that there is some continuity. They wrote, a genocidal system is not a matter of particular weapon structure or strategic concept, so much as an overall constellation of men, weapons, and warfighting plans, which, if implemented, could end human civilization in minutes, and the greater part of human life on the planet within days or even hours. And I agree with them. I think there is strong continuity between a nuclear and a genocidal logic, and not only for the immediate destruction, which would undoubtedly be enormous, but also for the incredibly long trail of environmental destruction that comes along with nuclear weapons and can render areas uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. So the second concern that's caught up in that question is also, what does it mean to incite genocide, which is a punishable crime in the Genocide Convention? And thus far, courts have been reluctant to address general threats, like the threat that you cited that Putin said, or the other case that kind of comes to mind is that of Iranian leader Ahmadinejad's statements that Iran would wipe Israel from the map. Right? That's probably the most infamous example. In this instance, though, I tend to agree with the courts that prosecuting a leader for generalized threats is most likely to escalate tensions rather than diminish them. And incitement, while theoretically it does not require that any act take place, for me, it makes most sense when it's relegated to a context where the words are directly tied to a call to action, right? A threat, it has action sort of implicit, and of course it's not without a certain violence, but it is also not an immediate and proximate call to take action. And I think treating it otherwise can bring on responses that are not helpful. They can escalate tensions. They can exile political mediation, which is invariably the best way to decrease tensions. And so I personally don't think it helps to think of that kind of threat that we've seen as incitement to genocide.
Thank you, Bridget. This is an extremely useful and timely conversation. I really appreciate your insight.
You are very welcome. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Chase Enright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
When it comes to nuclear weapons, I think we can all agree that how decisions are made is critical. Who gets a say in decision making? What knowledge is used to inform those decisions? Today, I'm joined by Benoit Pelopidas, a leading academic on nuclear weapons choices. Benoit is a founding director of the Nuclear Knowledges Program at the Centre for International Studies, Sciences Po, Paris. In France, Nuclear Knowledges is the first scholarly research program on the nuclear phenomenon that is fully independent and transparent on its funding sources. It categorically refuses to accept funding where there is a conflict of interest and accepts funding only based on scholarly criteria as assessed by peers. There, Benoit's research focuses on the construction of knowledge about nuclear weapons and the relation of nuclear-armed states and democratic choices. Benoit, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Emma.
So Benoit, you've got a new book out in French, soon to be released in English as well. And the title in English is Rethinking Nuclear Choices. What motivated you to write this book?
So this book has been in the making for 13 years, to tell you the truth. And its starting point was simply the realization of a mismatch between accepted knowledge and available evidence on 4 key issues related to nuclear weapons policy. The causes and pace of horizontal proliferation first, then the role of luck and the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions so far, the level of popular support for nuclear weapons policy in Western nuclear-armed democracies, and finally, the adequacy of expert debate about nuclear weapons policy. On those 4 issues, which are crucial because they shape the scope of publicly available nuclear weapons policy options, we had kind of accepted forms of knowledge, but if you kind of looked deeper at them, they were not that solidly established. So the starting point of the book really was, okay, how can we solidly establish those 4 claims? And if we cannot, then what does that mean?
So can you give us a bit of a taste of what were the findings you found on those 4 topics?
For those of your listeners who are the most policy oriented, you'll observe that if you accept that there is a macro law of history which says, by definition, nuclear weapons are inherently desirable and proliferation is the law of the land, it's inevitable, and all you can possibly do is manage it. If you accept that the cause for the absence of unwanted nuclear explosions so far is our perfect control over weapons. If you accept that there is a popular support for existing nuclear weapons policies and that experts are debating the issues that matter anyway, you see the outcome of all those assumptions is that existing nuclear weapons policies are obvious, are good, and are the only possible ones. So the finding is that all 4 are illusions of inevitability. And so undoing them essentially opens up a space for choice and a need for consistent justifications for present and future nuclear weapons choices.
So I'd like to ask you a bit more about deterrence theory and France's nuclear weapons policy and then close calls and mistakes and luck. But why don't we start off for the listeners who might not know as much about France's nuclear weapons history? Can you give us a bit of context here as we dive in? So what does the stockpile in France currently look like? And what is the history of debate around nuclear weapons in France?
So France roughly has 300 nuclear weapons in two modes of delivering them. That is, submarines and planes, which can either take off from land or from the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier. That is in super short form, the size of the arsenal and the force structure. But before I tell you more about French nuclear history and policy, I'd like to just insist on the fact that really looking at France is for us, and I say us, the team and I, is a way of assessing the validity of arguments which are commonly mobilized in nuclear armed democracies, not just in France. For example, in the French context, we would talk about consensus, and this is a kind of the established phrase. And in the UK, they don't use the word consensus, but there is a comparable assumption that overall the public is supportive of the existing policy. What's striking in the French case is that we still do not have a non-official history of the French nuclear weapons program, even if we have a lot of good work about the nuclear power program. So diplomatic historians have so far produced a first generation of work, which is really interesting, but very dependent on the testimonies of the policy and diplomatic elites that have conducted the program. We do not have the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act. In 2008, a new law has passed, which for the first time makes it possible to keep archival records classified in perpetuity for the sake of non-proliferation. So you heard me right. I said in perpetuity. So since at least the 1990s, beyond legal scholarship, nuclear weapons discourse in France has been limited to think tanks, mostly linked to the Ministry of Defense and to the manufacturers of the French nuclear arsenal. And over the last decade, the pro-disarmament entities such as Initiative pour le désarmement nucléaire or the French branch of ICANN have been more vocal. But really, over the last 5 years, there was a need to re-legitimize the French nuclear arsenal, given that additional funding was going to be needed for its modernization. So new writings have been supported and produced with a view to, quote, enhancing a culture of deterrence, end quote. And that's from a report from the French Senate from 2017. So precisely since 2017, the purpose of the Nuclear Knowledges Program has been to reassess what we can know about French nuclear history and policy.
So given this emphasis on the culture of deterrence that you've just mentioned, how does deterrence theory fit into France's nuclear weapons policy? And do you think this theory is convincing to the public?
So I think I should say three things. One is it's very rare to survey the French public about their knowledge level about nuclear weapons policy and attitudes towards it. And when they are surveyed, the surveys do produce those impressive numbers that create this narrative of consensus, which is then repeated by experts. But in the book, one of the things I do is I look at how those surveys were designed. And as soon as you do that, you realize that the survey design incorporates all the normative judgments that are at the basis of French nuclear weapons policy. So in the survey, it's assumed that the posture is strictly defensive, that there is no risk attached to the arsenal, that nuclear deterrence by definition deters and only deters, doesn't have adverse effects, and that non-nuclear deterrence would by definition fail. So if you build in all those assumptions, then the result of this survey no longer tells you what it claims to tell you. It essentially tells you how successful a communication campaign is. So we designed a survey and used the same sample and the same pollster as the Ministry of Defense, to make sure that that was kind of valid and comparable. But we were careful about two things. The first one was to, not repeat the mistake. So keep really a possibility for diverse options open and also diversify possible attitude instead of just asking respondents do you like French nuclear weapons or French nuclear weapons policies? If you actually ask them about the implicit commitments that the nuclear state is asking of them, that is, as a taxpayer, you're expected and required to fund the arsenal. As a French citizen, you are expected to accept that your country is being targeted because that's part of the deterrence game with a country with a larger arsenal. If you similarly say, as a French citizen, you are expected to entitle the French president to use nuclear weapons on your behalf. If you ask them those questions and you just combine the tax question and the question about acceptance of being targeted, the level of support is below 15%. And we conducted that survey also in the UK with the same type of question and similarly found a very low level of support, but evidence that what those policies have produced is a disempowerment of the public. The most frequent attitude is not that they are opposed, is that respondents say they don't want to have a say in this, either because they feel that they're not legitimate or that they feel that whatever they do will not matter. So I think that, the key finding there is that there's no massive popular support as soon as you survey it, right? And the one effect that you can document is that it has produced citizens' disempowerment. We also replicated that survey the next year to just check for consistency and to also change the pollster to increase the robustness of the finding to the best of our abilities. And the results were pretty consistent. And we intend to actually continue the replication to trace evolution over time.
Shifting gears, we know that we've had close calls and mistakes that could have led to nuclear catastrophe. In your research, you've tackled the question of how much luck contributes to our security. Can you share how you empirically documented several of these cases?
Thank you so much for asking this question. Let me start by just a few considerations about why assessing this question of luck matters a lot. Indeed, since at least the 1960s, policy and military officials in the US, in the UK, in Russia have stated that luck was necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions, not all the time, but in key crises of the nuclear age. And given that one catastrophic failure is radically intolerable, we need to have accurate knowledge and not misattribute this absence of unwanted nuclear explosions to control. So the list of those people could be long, but just, for those who are interested, it includes people like Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Dean Acheson, Special Envoy of President Kennedy dispatched to France at the time, Nikolai Leonov, Head of Cuban Affairs at the KGB at the same time, Gerald Smith, Chief U.S. Delegate to the SALT talks, and among post-Cold War figures closer to us, one can cite former head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command and Strategic Command General Butler, and U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry. And this is an incomplete list. But what's interesting is that scholarship as well as policy discourse have been uneasy with those claims and essentially failed to assess them as well as learn lessons from the role of luck so far. So really my starting point was, okay, what can we do about, again, this mismatch between what we think we know and what we can actually know? And I wanted to really pay attention to those claims because they are declarations against interest. All those people who make claims about the role of luck, they would look much better if they made the exact opposite claim. So that's why I wanted to kind of pause and take that seriously. So that's kind of the first step, realize the nature of those claims, and then simply identify the uneasiness and the implication of it, which is the temptation of overconfidence. And this temptation of overconfidence is at the heart of the book, and I call that epistemic vulnerability. It's the fact that essentially our knowledge is more fragile than we care to admit. So now, to get to your point, empirically, what I did is that I searched for claims about the role of factors exceeding human and organizational control in memoirs, correspondence, in speeches, and looked at the cases in which, private talk and public talk matched. So that was not for a particular audience. So interestingly, I didn't want to just, narrowly focus on the word luck, but really focus on factors incompatible with control. So far, in scholarship and policy discourse, we're committing two main mistakes about luck. One consists in claiming that it's impossible to measure. And so, because we cannot measure it, we should write, think, and give policy advice as though it doesn't matter. The second mistake is assuming that overall, what is labeled as luck is in fact a manifestation of professionalism or control, is just a mode of professionalism and control that wasn't understood. And so the second mistake was very helpful to me. In a way, that was a second research step. I was like, okay, if I want to be able to make luck researchable, because that's ultimately what we're talking about, how do you make luck researchable? The starting point was to build a distinctive definition of luck, which defines it as the opposite of control, so that you avoid the mistake I just outlined. So that allows you then to identify three modes of luck. And those are the three. If you reach your desired outcome thanks to a factor which is independent from control practice, that's mode one. Thanks to a failure of a control practice, that's mode two. Or in spite of the failure of a control practice, then you should call all three cases cases of luck. Only the third type is a sign of the macro resilience of the overall infrastructure, but it would, in any case, be faulty to attribute any of those cases to relabel them as successes of control. That's essentially the research design for luck.
When it comes to public discourse, it seems there's a strong similarity in the challenges we face here in the United States and in Europe, more specifically France, around nuclear weapons policy. How do you think we can engage the public in debate on nuclear weapons? And how do we provide people in a say with what keeps them safe?
There are indeed three common challenges to engaging the public, and I treat them as three sources of overconfidence in our knowledge about nuclear weapons and our ability to control them perfectly. The first source has to do with the fact that nuclear weapons related realities are outside of our daily world, out of sight, out of mind. And then there is, the common awareness that nuclear testing has gone underground since the 1980s. It's no longer even visible. The second source simply has to do with our inability to believe in what we know. I mean, our inability to believe that nuclear weapons related catastrophe are indeed possible. And this is a finding of a 2-year-long campaign of interviews across military personnel, policymakers, activists, regardless of the nuclear weapons policy preference. And they all confessed to this difficulty to really believe in the possibility of the disaster that they know is possible. So to address those first two sources of citizens' disempowerment and overcome the disbelief in the possibility of unwanted nuclear events, the go-to place really for me is fiction and visual popular culture. Particular aesthetic gestures in fiction have played a key role during the Cold War in getting citizens to experience and then believe in this possibility. The most famous example of those impactful movies would be, the famous Case of the Day After and its impact on Ronald Reagan. But what is striking, since we're talking about 2020, what is striking is that since the end of the Cold War, the existential threat depicted in popular culture has no longer been nuclear war, but instead a virus or a climate catastrophe. Nuclear weapons have only appeared in scenarios in which only a few bombs explode and no retaliation is possible. Their effects are minimized, manifesting the shared knowledge between the writers and the viewers that, of course, this will not happen. And when nuclear war is evoked, it is only as past event in an alternative reality or as something that was started by machines and not humans. Nuclear weapons are even sometimes portrayed as irreplaceable saviors of humanity in the face of asteroids on a collision course with Earth. Think about Michael Bay's 1998 blockbuster Armageddon, among many others, or against hostile aliens, Independence Day, or 2 decades later in Pacific Rim. So we need to recreate popular culture that helps us overcome our disbelief in the possibility of nuclear disasters. I think this is at least an avenue to engage the public. And if I'm allowed to say one more thing or suggest one more path, and here really this connects to the institutional project of the Nuclear Knowledges Program, it's that the third source of temptation of overconfidence relates to official experts' inability to give a complete picture of nuclear vulnerabilities for reasons that we can explain. You just need to clarify that. There is a discursive and a sociological dimension to this problem. At the discursive level, claims about deterrence, for example, do double work. They work as descriptions of how the world works, but also as performative. In other words, if you're semi-official expert, talking about deterrence is not just there to describe, it's there to convince that deterrence works. Therefore, even if you know of any limitations or limits of validity or limits of safety, you will probably not talk about them because you would regard them as jeopardizing the goal you want to achieve, which is convince that it does work. And at a sociological level, the reason why experts are disincentivized to give a complete picture of nuclear vulnerabilities has to do with the mandate of perfect control that governs nuclear weapons related institutions. And so in the book, I have empirical evidence of nuclear safety engineers who've witnessed cases of accidents, in particular in the case of the Sandia lab in the US and the private chief of staff of de Gaulle, who either decided not to report the bad news or who did report the bad news, but were told not to talk about it because that was going to create problem in Washington. So we essentially have empirical evidence of institutional incentives to underplay limits of controllability. And therefore, in the face of that, there is a need to just create a space of independent research, which is verifiable and doesn't commit any of those mistakes. This is why I'm really emphasizing the need and the right to be able to check the funding sources of any experts that your listeners listen to, and to also check whether the analysis that is offered reproduces language and assumptions of official discourse of any kind. So to summarize what I've said, popular culture is one key avenue to overcome the disbelief in the possibility of nuclear disaster. And the second thing is 2 criteria to distinguish independent research from experts who would have reasons to underplay the limits of control and limits of safety. And those 2 criteria are the refusal to reproduce normative assumptions of official discourse and simply a funding source that is independent.
Thank you, Benoit.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.